New York Times Magazine's editor Jake Silverstein has responded to some recent criticism of post-publication edits of the 1619 Project in an open response Friday, detailing how he says multi-platform publications of the print and the podcast offered some slight differences in language surrounding the project's description as the true founding of America.
Journalist Zaid Jilani has been following the latest controversy around the 1619 Project and joins us now to break down the latest. Great to see you, Zaid.
Good to see you, Zaid.
Yeah, great to be here.
Mm-hmm. First, why do you think that they felt it necessary to give this additional public response?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We actually saw public responses from three people. One was Jake Silverstein, who obviously is at the New York Times Magazine. One was Dean Baquet, who is the executive editor of the New York Times. And the last one was from Sulzberger himself, who is from the family who owns the New York Times itself. So it seems like there was kind of a unity of purpose among Times leadership to defend this series. But I think a lot of this came from an internal kind of pressure or revolt. So Bret Stephens, who's a New York Times columnist, wrote a critique of the 1619 Project. He drew, actually, it was really funny to see Bret Stephens linking to a socialist website, but he drew actually on a lot of left-wing critics. And it provoked apparently a very harsh reaction within the Times itself. Nicole Hannah-Jones was furious, as reported in the Washington Post. She was emailing a lot of the Times leadership saying it's unacceptable, or something to that extent. And I think that a lot of this is they're afraid of what happened with James Bennett. They don't want to see an internal staff revolt led by someone like Nicole Hannah-Jones. But I think, ironically, they're the ones who kind of put her in this position in the first place because they failed to properly fact-check and edit the series before it went live. This created an opportunity for many historians on the outside, James McPherson, Sean Wilentz, Adolph Reed Jr., and others, to point out it had numerous inaccuracies, omissions, errors. I wrote a piece or so about some of its inaccuracies and errors and talking about how immigration laws were formed. And I think this created an environment where basically the New York Times felt like it had to defend the project because of their own kind of mistakes of not just editing and fact-checking on the front end. Because had they done that, they could have saved themselves a lot of the embarrassment. They could have saved themselves Bret Stephens having to link to outside people to criticize them. And it really does show you that, like, you can't get around the truth in this day and age, right? Like, someone eventually will figure these things out. If you wanted to appease Nicole Hannah-Jones back in 2019 when this was being published, that ended up hurting you now. If you had just told her at that point, you can't write that, trying to maintain slavery was one of the main purposes of the American Revolution when there's no historical documentation of that. You can't make various claims about Abraham Lincoln that just weren't true. You can't write an article about the racial wealth gap and not mention the Great Recession or the Obama administration at all. It's silly. If they had done that, it would have saved her a lot of embarrassment now.
Yeah, Zaid, let's step back a bit. Why is any of this important? Why is this an important story? Why do you cover it as vociferously as you do? And we have you on all the time. To me, it is being pushed by the New York Times, one of the largest organizations in journalism. It's being pushed by some of the most powerful people in this country as a revisionist history of who we are. Why does this matter to somebody like you?
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason, so it matters for two reasons. One is that I think in terms of the field of journalism, we need to just get our facts right. We can't start cutting ourselves some slack because it happens to appeal to an ideology or whatever. We have to get our facts right. But second, in this case in particular, I think the way this project was constructed was to construct a narrative of cherry-picked facts, to propose a certain kind of telling of American history that supports a certain ideology. So, for instance, when Nicole Hannah-Jones writes that the Civil Rights Movement created the immigration reform laws in the 1960s, and it excludes the fact that actually it was Jewish Americans, Polish Americans, Greek Americans, Italian Americans who primarily formed the push, I think she was trying to create a white versus black version of history. I think that's the same reason why nowhere in the 1619 Project are you going to find an extensive history of the late 19th century, early 20th century populist movement, which was a multiracial movement. You're not going to read about Tom Watson organizing white farmers to defend blacks from lynchings because it doesn't fit the white versus black, I think, narrative of history that she's constructed in the 1619 Project. I think it's very problematic for school districts, a number of them, I think Chicago School District, other school districts, to be taking this on as history curriculum without pointing out that it's basically a series of kind of ideological op-eds, right? It's not a comprehensive history. It's not a full history of this country. And it includes a number of omissions, errors, and half-truths. And I think that when you have a major newspaper deciding that it's going to write basically a history that focuses around one racial group and not even the entire history of the racial group. It doesn't talk about cross-racial alliances of that group, for instance. It is problematic because it suggests that their commitment is not to truth, to the whole truth. Their commitment is to promoting one ideological narrative, which is a very troubling place for the New York Times in particular to be, because the New York Times is not the nation, right? The New York
Yes.
Times is not. It's not supposed to be an explicitly ideological publication for one faction, right? It's supposed to be a paper of common record for the country. And when you're not telling the whole country's history, and then when you have your backs up against the wall, you're defending it so harshly, you're refusing to correct pieces that they have done. It wasn't until one columnist wrote a mildly critical piece. Honestly, it wasn't that super critical, although it hit a lot of the right notes. They respond this way. I mean, I saw it this morning. They tapped someone to write an op-ed, another op-ed defending 1619, which is their own project, which already won a Pulitzer Prize, which is being promoted by all kinds of corporations and firms and school districts. It seems like the reason they probably got someone to write an op-ed defending it is because they're trying to shield themselves from their own staff with Bret Stephens.
Yeah.
It's a thorny situation that I think really could have been avoided had they just properly fact-checked and edited this thing to begin with, which they refused to do.
I guess part of the issue with that, though, is that these were central claims, right? The idea that the true founding was 1619, the idea that the real reason for the revolution was exclusively slavery. And as you've said, no one's saying that there weren't people for whom that was a motivating factor, but that was the one true reason. If you strip out those claims, do you think it gets as much attention or lands in the same way that with the same massive impact that it has in the sphere? And then also, what did you make specifically of the response that they did issue?
Well, actually, those two things are related because I believe it was either Dean Baquet, who's the executive editor of the Times, or it was Sulzberger, who owns the Times, who said that it was groundbreaking journalism, right? And, when I read that, I thought to myself, one, there was almost no journalism in the entire series, right? They did very little actual reporting in this series. They were mostly collecting from other sources, people who have written, New School of Capitalism, people. And then second, it wasn't really groundbreaking. Nothing, I've heard this, I've heard stories that Abraham Lincoln told a group of African Americans they should go back to Africa. I've heard that for decades, right? I feel like I was in high school. If you read Howard Zinn and you'll know these things, right? Nothing in this series was groundbreaking, and very little of it was journalism. But I feel like the reason that they have to say that now is for reputational reasons, right? I think they have to defend the idea that what they did was new and original, rather than quite hackneyed and quite unoriginal. Basically, everything stated in these pieces can be found elsewhere, you have to. It gives them a little bit of cover for the poor fact checking and editing to claim that it was original, because then they can kind of slyly claim that, they're breaking new ground. So of course it's going to be controversial.
Right.
But the reason it's controversial is because it relies on discredited scholarship. That's the actual reason it's controversial.
Yeah,
So,
I think these are such important points, Zed. Well, thank you for joining us, man. We really appreciate it.
Great to see you, Zed.
Yep.
Still to come, new eyewitness reports are raising some serious questions about the shooting of an alleged Antifa member. The Nation's Ken Klippenstein is going to tell us what we know now when Rising returns.